Hello, in this video we are going to talk more about functions. Last video we saw void functions. Now we're going to talk about value returning functions. Void functions didn't return anything. They just printed something to the screen. That was again the printed stuff was just information for us, just so we know what's going on in that function. We can use void functions to have a bunch of print statements to do something inside a function, right? And to not return anything. So it's like going into a room and performing the activities that you need right there, and then you come back from there. You don't bring anything back, something like that. So value returning function is something that brings something back. So for example, here is the foo again, the foo function. From there, out comes 2. So 2 is coming back, and we do whatever we want with that 2 or the variable that comes back. So we are going to see, first of all, how to return these values, and then what do? We do several things with these values that come back to us. Okay, so we could save it for later. The return value may be assigned to a variable. For example, w equals foo. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to jump over to my Replit, and we are going to try and write code for each one of these things as we talk about it. That way it will make a little bit of sense. So let's go and say new REPL and create a new REPL and call this value return. Okay, and let's see what we're doing here. Go back to our lesson. So first of all, we're going to call a function. It's going to return something, and we're going to store it. That's one way to use a value that is returned from a function. And let's go, let's start doing our def, and we have a function called foo. And let's say in that function, we are trying to read a number from the user. So num equals 0, num equals int. You all know by now how to do int, input, and input. And we're going to say enter, let's try this, enter a number. And so we read a number into num, and I'm going to simply return that num. And then we can go and call foo. But what do we do with that number, and where is that coming back? So let's write another function called def main. So def main is perhaps going to call foo. So now you know, by now you've seen we could call multiple functions, we could write multiple functions, call them from different places. Let's say I call foo. Okay, I call foo, but then it is returning something. So if I simply call foo, what is it going to do? It's going to come back with a value, and I'm going to throw it off. I don't want to throw it off. So let's create a local variable called mynum equals 0. And so when foo comes back with a value, let's say I put it in mynum. And then I print maybe to the user saying your number from foo is, and we output that. And that is sitting in mynum, right? And we're going to trace this in a minute. So here's main. So what happens? Just like control goes to def foo, creates a frame for foo. Then it comes to main, creates a frame for main. By now we know how that works. And then it jumps to line 11 where it calls main. So control comes to main. We go to line 6, then we go into line 7 where we declare a variable mynum, set it to 0. Then on the next line, we say mynum equals, and we call this function foo. So the minute we call this function foo, control jumps to foo. And we go into foo and declare a local variable called num. This is local to this function. This num exists only inside foo. Mynum exists only inside main. So they're all like their own rooms. Okay, so you go in here, num gets created. We read num from the user. That's what's happening on line 3. And so whatever the user enters goes into num, and we return that num. The minute we return from that function, this frame disappears, if you want to think about it like that. The number is coming back on its way to line 8, and it gets put into mynum. So when num comes back, it goes into mynum. There's no more num variable when we leave that function. The minute we are out of that function and num, the value goes into my num, that num doesn't exist anymore. But now we are in the scope of main and it's my num. And so we print my num, and my num has the value that the user enters from that function. So if you run the program, the user doesn't see any of that. All the user sees is says enter a number 34, and it says your number from foo is 34. So the number actually got read in foo, went into num, got returned, and got put into my num. And we can save it. We might want to turn around and send this my num to another function that checks for whatever. Maybe it checks to see if the number is even or odd, right? So that's how value returning functions work. So we save it for later. That's what we just did. We saved it in my num, and we could do whatever we want to with it. Okay. So here's an example where it talks about a random int is a function that generates a random number. So it generates a random number between 1 and 10. That's what this says. And if you multiply a number by 2, it's always going to be an even number, right? So that's what that does. So you could take this, for example, and put it in my line of code here. Instead of reading a number from the user, let's say I put a hash and I comment that out. And let's say here num equals, and we take away this variable and we say num equals random.randint, for which I must do import random. So let's go here and say import random. There we go. So now randint will work for us. Randint is a function that comes from the random library. So by giving it 2 parameters or arguments, it says it should be arguments 1, comma 10. We are saying generate a random number between 1 and 10, and we multiply it by 2. So it generates a random number multiplied by 2. That number is always going to be even because we multiplied by 2, and then we return that number. So now if you run the program, it's going to do something a little different. It says your random number is 20, or your number from foo is 20. You run it again, you get a different number because it's a random number. So this is a little different, right? It's a randint function that in itself is a function. It gets a value and we do something with that. So this is the function now as an example, gets a value. We take that, multiply by 2. So when a function returns something, you may use it in calculations, which is what we're doing. Use it in a formula or expression. Okay? Or you could send it to another function. In this case, input is a function that takes a prompt, reads a number, sends it, the whole thing gets sent into another function called float, where it gets converted into a float. Then we put it into a variable called cost, right? So there's several different ways. What we did was we returned this number here, and it got put into this variable mynum. And I could write another function if I wanted. Let's write another function to see if the number that we get is even, okay? But then this has to now take this number. So maybe we call this num. Now we are talking about functions that take something and do something with it. So here I could check if num mod 2 equals 0, then I would say, print even, else print odd, or something like that. So what I could do is after I get this mynum, I could turn around and call check even, which is the other function that I just wrote, and I could send mynum to it. And so what this is going to do is it's going to take this number that the random number generates, sends it back, goes into mynum, prints mynum, and we turn around and call check even with this mynum. So whatever is in mynum will go into num here when we call the function. It's like taking mynum from one room into another room and putting it into this box called num. And we check to see if that num is even, which is what this is doing. It will print even, else it prints odd. So I've given you a little more than just value returning functions. So if you run this program, the first thing it does is generates a random number, which is 14. Well, actually, it was whatever random number, must have been 7, multiplied by 2, which gave me 14. 14 came into my num here, because that's the order in which we do this function. Foo gets called, random number gets generated, gets multiplied by 2, return, comes into my num, prints my num, says your number from foo is 14. 14 gets sent to check even and goes into num. So num is 14. 14 mod 2 is 0, so it prints even. And so you can keep running this as many times as you want. You will always get even because we are multiplying it by 2. There's never a chance of getting an odd number.